Deception. This video is based on key insights from the book Deception by Rand Paul. Introduction. Rand Paul opens with a dramatic scene, imagining the fear felt by Dr. Shi Jingli, a leading scientist at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, as news of the emerging COVID-19 virus spread. The author immediately suggests a potential link between the virus's origin and the lab, hinting at a cover-up driven by the Chinese Communist Party's need to control information and protect its image. Paul emphasizes the pressure she would have felt, knowing that admitting fault could have severe consequences, referencing the disappearance of a colleague who challenged the party line. This sets the stage for a narrative focused on concealing the truth rather than a transparent investigation. The author portrays Shi as a highly accomplished scientist, aware of the political dangers within China's system. Paul suggests Shi's work, including research on making viruses more infectious, known as gain-of-function research, was conducted with the approval and direction of a high-ranking military scientist, General Zhou Yusen. This is a crucial point for Paul, as it begins to build a case that responsibility extends beyond Shi and potentially implicates the Chinese military. He notes she even sought funding from a U.S. defense agency for similar research, foreshadowing a later claim of U.S. involvement. Paul details Shi's desperate attempt to erase evidence, specifically the destruction of her coronavirus database, as the first step in a larger cover-up. The timing is significant. September 2019, months before the world became aware of the pandemic. The author then broadens the scope, accusing not only the Chinese government of dishonesty, particularly regarding the virus's transmissibility, but also the U.S. government. Paul alleges a deliberate effort to hide the extent of U.S. funding for the very type of risky research that may have contributed to the pandemic. The author's introduction is a clear statement of his central argument. The COVID-19 pandemic wasn't simply a natural disaster, but a consequence of dangerous research and a subsequent multi-layered cover-up. Paul frames the narrative as a story of hidden truths and deliberate deception, laying the groundwork for a critique of both Chinese and American public health and governmental responses. He implies a failure of transparency and accountability, suggesting that both governments prioritized political considerations over honest investigation and public safety. Part 1. The Cover-Up. Rand Paul details a troubling story of how the COVID-19 pandemic response was marred by secrecy and potential cover-ups within the highest levels of the U.S. public health establishment. The chapter begins with the early days of the outbreak in Wuhan, China, and quickly focuses on concerns about the possibility of a lab leak. Even as initial reports downplayed human-to-human transmission, scientists like Robert Redfield, head of the CDC, suspected the virus might have originated at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Paul argues that Redfield's concerns were immediately dismissed by Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, who had a vested interest in distancing himself from research funded at the Wuhan lab. Paul contends that Fauci's priority wasn't uncovering the truth, but protecting his reputation and the substantial funding flowing to his institute. This led to Redfield being excluded from key meetings and a deliberate effort to promote the theory of a natural origin for the virus, despite early evidence suggesting otherwise. The author highlights the crucial role of scientists like Yangzhen Zhang, who quickly sequenced the virus, but was pressured by the Chinese government to suppress the information. This delay in sharing the genetic code hampered the global response. The narrative then focuses on a series of frantic communications between leading scientists in January 2020, revealing growing alarm about the possibility of a lab leak. Emails obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests show that Fauci was informed of these concerns, yet he actively worked to downplay them. Paul emphasizes that Fauci's actions weren't simply about scientific disagreement, but a calculated attempt to control the narrative and shield himself from blame. The author points to Fauci's past support for gain-of-function research experiments that make viruses more dangerous, as a key factor in his reluctance to consider the lab leak theory. Paul details how Fauci and his allies orchestrated a public relations campaign to discredit the lab leak hypothesis. A key piece of this effort was the publication of the proximal origin paper in Nature, authored by scientists who initially expressed concerns about a lab leak but later reversed their position. The author argues that these scientists were influenced by Fauci and motivated by self-interest, receiving substantial grant funding after publishing the paper. Paul presents evidence that these scientists privately expressed doubts about a natural origin, only to publicly champion the opposite view. The chapter reveals a pattern of deception and obstruction, with Fauci allegedly directing his staff to avoid scrutiny of the Wuhan lab's research and to actively suppress any information that might suggest a lab leak. Paul highlights the conflict of interest inherent in Fauci's position, arguing that his long-standing support for gain-of-function research and his close ties to the Wuhan Institute of Virology compromised his ability to objectively assess the origins of the virus. The author concludes that the early response to the pandemic was deeply flawed, driven by political considerations and a desire to protect the interests of those in power, rather than a genuine commitment to public health. Paul suggests that this failure to address the possibility of a lab leak had serious consequences, hindering efforts to understand and contain the virus. Rand Paul details a troubling story of how scientists and government officials seemed more interested in protecting a narrative than finding the truth about where COVID-19 came from. He argues that a rush to dismiss the possibility of a lab leak in Wuhan, China, was driven by politics and a desire to shield those involved in risky research. Early on, before all the facts were known, prominent scientists quickly published a letter in the Lancet Medical Journal condemning any suggestion the virus didn't originate naturally. Paul points out this was unusual, as it sounded more like political opinion than scientific debate. He names Peter Daszak, a scientist with close ties to the Wuhan lab, as a key figure in organizing this quick response, and notes Daszak didn't reveal his financial connections to the lab. The author contends that this initial dismissal stifled important questions. He highlights how the scientific community, and particularly those funded by Dr. Fauci's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, seemed determined to push the natural origin theory, even when evidence began to suggest otherwise. Paul describes how researchers were actively downplaying the possibility of a lab accident, labeling anyone who raised concerns as spreading conspiracy theories. He points to the discovery of a research proposal called Diffuse, where scientists were seeking funding to modify bat coronaviruses, specifically to add a feature called a furin cleavage site, which makes viruses more infectious. The author emphasizes the striking coincidence that COVID-19 also had this feature, raising serious questions about whether the virus could have been created in a lab. Paul details how attempts to investigate these concerns were met with resistance. He explains that the Lancet eventually admitted its mistake in publishing the initial letter without disclosing conflicts of interest, and formed a commission to investigate the origins of the virus. However, he argues this was too little, too late. He describes how even when presented with evidence suggesting a lab leak, officials like Dr. Fauci seemed unwilling to seriously consider the possibility, even under oath. The author notes Fauci's difficulty recalling meetings and collaborations with key researchers involved in the Wuhan lab, which Paul finds suspicious. The narrative continues with Paul's frustration over the lack of transparency and cooperation from government agencies. He describes how the NIH continued to fund EcoHealth Alliance, the organization led by Daszak, despite concerns about its role in the pandemic and its connections to the Wuhan lab. He also points out that the Chinese government's investigation was not trustworthy, as they had a clear incentive to protect their own interests. Paul emphasizes that the evidence increasingly pointed towards a lab leak, including the fact that the virus appeared pre-adapted for human transmission, meaning it didn't need to evolve much to become highly contagious. He notes that despite extensive testing, no animal source of the virus has been found. Rand Paul concludes by highlighting the dangers of gain-of-function research, where scientists deliberately modify viruses to make them more dangerous, and the need for greater oversight. He argues that the focus on dismissing the lab leak theory allowed risky research to continue unchecked. He expresses concern that the same mistakes could be made again, leading to another pandemic. He calls for a full and honest investigation into the origins of COVID-19, not to assign blame, but to learn from the past and prevent future catastrophes. He believes the public deserves to know the truth, even if it's uncomfortable, and that transparency is essential for protecting public health. Part 2, Fatal Conceit. Rand Paul details a growing frustration with the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, focusing on what he sees as failures within the public health system and government overreach. His first direct encounter with Dr. Fauci during a Senate hearing revealed early disagreements, particularly regarding potential treatments like remdesivir and the understanding of the virus's impact on children. Paul questioned Fauci about remdesivir, noting early reports of its promise, only to later learn it was less effective than common steroids. He also challenged the assumption that children weren't being infected, suggesting broader testing could lower perceived fatality rates. Paul felt Fauci's initial responses were reasonable, but quickly became critical of what he perceived as dishonesty regarding data from China. He alleges Fauci misrepresented the level of cooperation received, and that the WHO delegation included a scientist with a conflict of interest. This established a pattern in Paul's view: a lack of transparency and a willingness to prioritize political narratives over scientific honesty. He recounts a personal experience with a flesh-eating bacterial infection, highlighting the potential benefits of steroids, a treatment Fauci initially dismissed. Later studies proved Paul correct about the effectiveness of steroids in severe COVID cases, reinforcing his belief in Fauci's flawed judgment and the potential cost of that error. The author describes a disturbing shift in medicine, where established medical expertise was sidelined in favor of centralized government directives. He shares stories of doctors struggling to obtain potentially life-saving treatments for their patients due to rigid protocols. One example involved monoclonal antibody treatments denied to patients needing them most. Paul argues this created a system where doctors became mere followers of orders, rather than independent medical professionals. He points to examples of hypocrisy from government officials, like Gavin Newsom, who enforced strict rules for citizens while bending them for themselves. Paul's own experience contracting COVID-19 became a flashpoint. He faced intense criticism and accusations for continuing to live normally while awaiting test results, despite being asymptomatic. He felt unfairly targeted, and the incident highlighted the divisive atmosphere fueled by the media and political opponents. He volunteered at a local hospital after recovering, offering assistance to overwhelmed healthcare workers, but felt his efforts were overshadowed by the ongoing political debate. The author strongly criticizes the massive government spending in response to the pandemic, particularly the CARES Act. He opposed the legislation due to its lack of fiscal responsibility, arguing that new spending should be offset by cuts elsewhere. Paul repeatedly attempted to introduce amendments to reduce spending, such as cutting foreign aid, but was consistently outvoted. He believes the unchecked spending contributed to a growing national debt and a weakening of the American economy. He details instances of fraud and misuse of funds, like Lamborghini purchases made with PPP loans, further illustrating his concerns about government waste. Paul's narrative paints a picture of a public health bureaucracy that prioritized control and political agendas over sound science, individual liberty, and fiscal responsibility. Rand Paul recounts a frustrating experience with the response to COVID-19, arguing that public health officials made serious mistakes and ignored established scientific knowledge. He begins by pointing out a stark contrast. In 2004, Dr. Fauci acknowledged that having had the flu provided better protection than the flu vaccine. Yet by 2020, this understanding of natural immunity seemed to vanish, a shift Paul finds deeply troubling. He describes being questioned by reporters about wearing a mask after recovering from COVID-19, calmly explaining his immunity only to be met with disbelief and accusations of ignorance. Paul felt a wave of know-nothingism had overtaken the conversation. He details how studies showing the limited effectiveness of masks were dismissed, and how even Fauci privately admitted masks weren't very useful while publicly promoting them. Paul highlights the hypocrisy, recalling a Senate hearing where Fauci denied masking was theater despite wearing a cloth mask. He cites research, including the DANMASK study and a Vietnamese study on influenza masks, demonstrating a lack of clear evidence supporting mask mandates. He argues the media simply repeated information they were given without critical thinking. The author criticizes the media for conflating mask use in medical settings with effectiveness against viruses in public spaces. He felt he was unfairly labeled as anti-science for questioning the prevailing narrative. Paul points to the Twitter files as evidence of government pressure on social media companies to censor dissenting voices, including his own, for questioning the official line on masking and immunity. He describes being suspended from YouTube for sharing information about mask ineffectiveness, a decision he saw as censorship. Paul emphasizes the importance of natural immunity, noting that prior infection provides significant protection against reinfection. He recalls a case of a woman who survived both the 1918 Spanish flu and COVID-19, still possessing antibodies decades later. He laments that this long-understood principle of immunology was disregarded during the pandemic. He attempted to convince the Trump administration to prioritize surrounding the president with individuals who had recovered from COVID-19, a suggestion he says was ignored. The author details the damaging consequences of dismissing natural immunity, including the firing of healthcare workers who had recovered from COVID-19 and chose not to be vaccinated. He points out the changing guidelines regarding quarantine periods and testing requirements, highlighting the lack of consistent scientific reasoning. Paul recounts his own experience volunteering in a COVID ward and sharing insights gained from clinical practice. He notes the discovery of effective treatments like prone positioning and high-dose steroids, which he believes were initially overlooked. Paul strongly criticizes the rigidity of vaccine mandates, particularly for young, healthy individuals, and the risks of vaccine-induced myocarditis. He points to studies showing that natural immunity offered comparable or even superior protection to vaccination. He expresses frustration with the media's refusal to acknowledge these findings and their reliance on flawed or misrepresented data. He cites examples of studies that were ignored or downplayed, and the eventual admission by the CDC that natural immunity was indeed protective. The author describes the media's tendency to attack individuals who challenge the official narrative, portraying them as dangerous or irresponsible. He recounts personal threats and harassment he received, including a disturbing letter containing white powder. Paul argues that the focus on vaccination overshadowed the importance of natural immunity and individual risk assessment. He concludes by emphasizing the need for open scientific debate and a rejection of groupthink in public health policy. He believes that a more nuanced approach, based on evidence and respect for individual autonomy, is essential for navigating future health crises. Rand Paul details a growing frustration with the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically focusing on what he sees as catastrophic failures within the public health bureaucracy. The chapter opens with a stark image of emptiness, a nearly deserted airport and Capitol building, illustrating the drastic measures taken during lockdowns. Paul argues that Congress, with minimal debate and attendance, rapidly approved massive spending bills, fueled by what he describes as COVID hysteria. He highlights a situation where a single senator could object to a recorded vote, effectively allowing huge sums of money to be spent with little accountability. Paul himself allowed the vote to proceed, fearing blame, if senators were compelled to travel and potentially spread the virus. The core of Paul's argument centers on the idea that the response was driven by fear and flawed data, rather than sound scientific reasoning. He points to early models that significantly overestimated the virus's mortality rate and contrasts that with emerging evidence suggesting widespread immunity within the population. Paul contends that focusing on lockdowns and spending trillions was a misguided approach, arguing that reopening the economy was the true solution. He criticizes Anthony Fauci for downplaying evidence of immunity and for promoting fear, even as data indicated the virus was less deadly than initially believed. Paul details a Senate hearing where he challenged Fauci on the lack of optimism and the continued push for restrictions, despite growing evidence that children were at very low risk. Paul accuses Fauci of hypocrisy and a desire to maintain control over the narrative. He cites an email exchange where Fauci thanked a scientist for publicly supporting the idea that the virus originated naturally, suggesting a concern about protecting funding for research. The author further criticizes Fauci's shifting stances on school reopenings, highlighting how the public health expert often contradicted himself and relied on vague criteria rather than clear scientific evidence. Paul emphasizes the importance of decentralized decision-making, referencing Friedrich Hayek's concept of fatal conceit, the idea that central planners cannot possibly possess enough knowledge to effectively manage a complex system like an economy or public health crisis. The chapter illustrates Paul's belief that the public health bureaucracy overstepped its bounds, stifling debate and imposing restrictions based on flawed predictions. He points to the track record of Neil Ferguson, a modeler whose previous predictions were wildly inaccurate, as an example of the dangers of relying on flawed expertise. Paul argues that the focus on fear and control undermined individual liberty and economic prosperity. He concludes by expressing his concern that the massive debt incurred during the pandemic threatens the long-term stability of the country, and that a more balanced, evidence-based approach was desperately needed. Ultimately, Paul paints a picture of a public health response that was driven by panic, political considerations, and a dangerous concentration of power in the hands of a few individuals. Part 3, Confronting Deception. Rand Paul details a growing frustration with the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic by public health officials, particularly Anthony Fauci, and the broader government response. He argues that initial justifications for lockdowns, to flatten the curve and prevent hospital overload, morphed into a belief that lockdowns could actually stop the pandemic, a shift he believes was unsupported by evidence. Paul points to the high death rates in New York and New Jersey, despite strict lockdowns, and contrasts them with Sweden's more relaxed approach, which resulted in a significantly lower death rate. He questions whether government interventions could truly alter the course of a virus, suggesting the outcomes were similar regardless of policy. Paul's concerns extend to the financial fallout of the pandemic. He highlights reports of stimulus checks being sent to deceased individuals and expresses dismay at the widespread fraud within programs like the Paycheck Protection Program, where funds were misused for luxury purchases. He criticizes both Democrats and Republicans for continuing to spend vast amounts of money, adding to the national debt, even as the pandemic continued. He felt the spending was reckless and unsustainable. A key point of contention for Paul is the dismissal of naturally acquired immunity. He cites studies suggesting that prior infection with common coronaviruses could offer some protection against COVID-19, and that immunity after a COVID infection itself was robust and long-lasting. He repeatedly challenged Fauci on this point, arguing that individuals with prior infection or vaccination shouldn't be subjected to ongoing mask mandates, calling it theater. Paul felt Fauci consistently downplayed the significance of natural immunity, prioritizing continued restrictions. The author reveals a behind-the-scenes glimpse into the politicization of science, detailing how Fauci and Francis Collins actively worked to discredit dissenting scientific opinions and suppress information that challenged the prevailing narrative. He points to an exchange where Fauci and Collins coordinated to counter a Science magazine article questioning the lab leak theory, demonstrating a willingness to prioritize a specific viewpoint over open scientific debate. Paul believed this showed a troubling bias within the public health bureaucracy. Paul's narrative culminates in a series of tense exchanges with Fauci during Senate hearings. He pressed Fauci for evidence supporting continued mask mandates, particularly for those with immunity, and questioned the basis for policies that seemed to lack a strong scientific foundation. He felt Fauci consistently relied on conjecture and dismissed evidence that contradicted his recommendations. The author paints a picture of a public health establishment resistant to acknowledging alternative perspectives and unwilling to adapt its strategies based on emerging data, ultimately contributing to a flawed and damaging response to the pandemic. Rand Paul details a frustrating battle to uncover what he believes were disastrous decisions made by public health officials, specifically Dr. Anthony Fauci, during the COVID-19 pandemic. The core of his argument centers on the idea that the National Institutes of Health, NIH, under Fauci's leadership, funded risky research in Wuhan, China, that may have contributed to the pandemic's origin. Paul contends that this research involved gain of function, meaning scientists were altering viruses to make them more easily infect humans, a practice he views as incredibly dangerous. He repeatedly accuses Fauci of lying to Congress about this funding, presenting evidence of grants and collaborations between American scientists and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Paul's frustration stems from what he sees as a deliberate attempt to downplay the possibility that the virus escaped from a lab. He describes tense exchanges during Senate hearings where he pressed Fauci for answers, only to be met with denials and what Paul characterizes as evasive language. He points to emails and reports that suggest NIH staff were aware the research in Wuhan involved manipulating viruses in a way that could increase their ability to infect people. Yet Fauci continued to claim no such funding occurred. Paul highlights the fact that even after concerns were raised, funding continued to flow to the Wuhan lab through organizations like EcoHealth Alliance. The author emphasizes a pattern of covering up information and a lack of transparency. He details how the NIH seemingly redefined gain-of-function research to avoid oversight, allowing potentially dangerous experiments to continue without proper review. Paul argues that this was a reckless gamble with public safety, and that Fauci prioritized continuing the research over investigating the possibility of a lab leak. He points to a specific instance where NIH allowed EcoHealth Alliance to self-report on whether their research qualified as gain-of-function, a clear conflict of interest. Paul's narrative reveals a deep distrust of the public health bureaucracy. He believes that officials like Fauci were more concerned with protecting their own reputations and continuing their research agendas than with honestly assessing the risks and origins of the pandemic. He details sending a criminal referral to the Justice Department, accusing Fauci of lying to Congress, but expresses little hope for prosecution due to what he perceives as political bias. Ultimately, Paul paints a picture of a system that failed to adequately oversee risky research, suppressed dissenting voices, and ultimately contributed to a global catastrophe. He argues that the mainstream media largely enabled this cover-up by accepting Fauci's explanations without critical scrutiny. He believes the truth about the pandemic's origins and the role of gain-of-function research is essential for preventing future outbreaks and holding those responsible accountable. The author concludes that the evidence strongly suggests a lab leak is a plausible and even likely scenario, and that the continued denial from public health officials is a disservice to the millions who have suffered and died. Part 4, Asserting the Truth. Rand Paul argues that the response to COVID-19 revealed serious problems with how public health officials and the government handled the pandemic. He believes the initial fears about the virus were greatly exaggerated by the media and the government, leading to unnecessary panic. Paul points to polls showing that many people, especially Democrats, significantly overestimated the risks of hospitalization and death from COVID-19. He criticizes the willingness of some to support forceful government actions, like fines or even taking children from unvaccinated parents, as a dangerous overreach of authority. The author highlights examples of individuals, like tennis player Novak Djokovic and football quarterback Aaron Rodgers, who stood up against what they saw as government overreach and a violation of personal freedom. Paul himself recounts making the decision to rely on his natural immunity after a mild case of COVID-19, despite facing criticism. He also mentions NBA player Jonathan Isaac, who similarly chose not to get vaccinated based on his own assessment of risk and immunity. Paul emphasizes that this wasn't about denying the virus, but about the right to make personal health choices. A central focus of Paul's critique is Dr. Anthony Fauci, whom he accuses of dishonesty and a cover-up regarding funding for gain-of-function research in Wuhan, China. This type of research involves modifying viruses to study their potential dangers, but Paul argues it's incredibly risky and could lead to even more dangerous pandemics. He points to the NIH removing the definition of gain-of-function from its website as evidence of an attempt to hide information. During a Senate hearing, Paul aggressively questioned Fauci about this funding, accusing him of misleading the public and potentially endangering the world. Paul contends that Fauci consistently downplayed the risks of the research and changed definitions to avoid accountability. He believes Fauci's actions demonstrate a pattern of prioritizing his own reputation and maintaining power over transparency and public safety. The author details how Fauci's salary increased significantly over time, especially after 9/11, when biodefense research was centralized under his control. Paul suggests this created a system where Fauci had immense influence and a potential conflict of interest. The author further criticizes the lack of transparency surrounding financial relationships between NIH scientists and pharmaceutical companies. He describes how scientists received millions of dollars in royalty payments from companies whose products they were researching and approving. Paul argues this creates a clear conflict of interest and undermines public trust in the scientific process. He attempted to obtain detailed information about these payments through Freedom of Information Act requests, but the NIH heavily redacted the information, making it difficult to understand the extent of the financial ties. Paul also takes issue with Fauci's push for COVID-19 boosters for children, arguing there was insufficient evidence to support the recommendation. He points out that most children had already been infected with the virus and questioned the benefit of boosters in that population. He accuses Fauci of ignoring data that didn't fit his narrative and of downplaying the risks of myocarditis, a heart condition associated with the vaccine in young boys. Finally, Rand Paul reveals that after the purchase of Twitter by Elon Musk, it was discovered that government agencies, including the FBI, had been working with social media companies to censor information about COVID-19. He believes this is a dangerous violation of free speech and a sign of government overreach. He concludes that the COVID-19 pandemic exposed a dangerous concentration of power in the hands of unelected officials like Fauci and a willingness to suppress dissenting opinions in the name of public health. Rand Paul details a frustrating battle to uncover what he believes were serious mistakes made by public health officials, particularly Dr. Fauci, during the COVID-19 pandemic. The chapter centers on Paul's attempts to hold these officials accountable for what he sees as a pattern of dishonesty and a disregard for basic scientific principles. He begins by highlighting a 2004 C-SPAN interview where Dr. Fauci stated that having the flu for 14 days provided as much protection as a vaccine, a statement Paul contrasts with Fauci's later promotion of repeated COVID vaccinations, even for those who had already been infected. Paul describes a deliberate effort to confront Fauci with this earlier statement during a Senate hearing, overcoming obstacles put in place by Senator Murray, who banned video presentations. Paul argues that Fauci consistently downplayed the importance of natural immunity gained from prior infection, despite acknowledging its effectiveness in the past. He points to studies showing a high percentage of children had already contracted COVID-19, yet guidelines didn't account for this natural protection. Paul contends that the government's focus on vaccination, without considering prior infection, was a flawed approach. He accuses Fauci of rejecting sound immunology and prioritizing vaccine promotion, questioning whether financial ties to pharmaceutical companies influenced these decisions. Paul repeatedly asks for transparency regarding potential conflicts of interest, specifically royalties received by scientists involved in vaccine approvals, a request consistently denied. The author then shifts focus to the issue of gain-of-function research, experiments that modify viruses to make them more dangerous. Paul expresses outrage that he struggled to get congressional hearings on the origins of COVID-19, believing there was a deliberate attempt to hide information about research conducted at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. He finally secured a hearing through Senator Hassan's subcommittee, but it was largely boycotted by Democrats. Paul presented testimony from scientists who agreed that the research in Wuhan was risky and potentially contributed to the pandemic. He emphasizes that this research involved making viruses more transmissible and dangerous, and questions why it was funded with taxpayer dollars. Paul details how the government's oversight of gain-of-function research was weak, allowing potentially dangerous experiments to continue. He explains the P3CO framework, intended to review risky research, was largely ineffective because the NIH failed to identify and flag projects that should have been reviewed. He argues that Fauci and others deliberately circumvented regulations, allowing research to proceed without proper scrutiny. Paul highlights the fact that the names of those on the P3CO committee were kept secret, and their decisions were not made public. Rand Paul concludes by emphasizing the need for greater transparency and accountability within the scientific bureaucracy. He believes the public deserves to know if scientists approving vaccines have financial interests in the companies producing them. He argues that the government's response to the pandemic was hampered by a lack of honest debate and a willingness to ignore basic scientific principles, ultimately leading to unnecessary restrictions and a loss of public trust. He frames the situation as a matter of national security, warning that the potential for engineered viruses poses a greater threat than nuclear weapons. Rand Paul details a growing conviction that the COVID-19 pandemic stemmed from a lab leak, fueled by concerns over risky research practices. He highlights testimony suggesting the virus showed signs of being intentionally altered, a process known as gain-of-function research. Witnesses like Stephen Key pointed to specific genetic markers indicating lab manipulation, while Bob Kadlec, after an investigation, concluded a research-related incident in Wuhan was the more likely origin. Paul emphasizes that safety protocols at the Wuhan Institute of Virology were inadequate for the dangerous work being conducted, a key observation for those suspecting a lab leak. He contrasts this with the initial attempts to dismiss the lab leak theory, particularly by figures like Anthony Fauci, who Paul accuses of trying to silence dissenting voices. The chapter also dismantles the early narrative of the virus originating at a wet market in Wuhan. While acknowledging the possibility of natural spillover, Paul presents evidence challenging this idea. Investigators found no evidence of the virus in animals at the market, and the earliest cases weren't linked to it. Instead, the initial outbreak clustered near the Wuhan Institute of Virology and along a specific subway line, suggesting a different point of origin. Paul points out that China's own CDC admitted the wet market wasn't the source, a fact largely ignored by mainstream media. He stresses that the lack of genetic diversity in early samples, unlike what would be expected from a natural spillover, further supports the lab leak hypothesis. Paul's narrative reveals a deep distrust of the public health response, particularly concerning the suppression of alternative theories. He criticizes Fauci's attempts to control the narrative and highlights the independence of figures like Cadleck, who ultimately supported the lab leak theory despite initial pressure. The author details how scientists, like Richard Ebright, acknowledged both possibilities: natural spillover and a lab accident, but emphasized the circumstantial evidence pointing towards the Wuhan lab. This evidence included the location of the outbreak, the lab's extensive virus collection, and the inadequate safety measures in place. A significant portion of the chapter focuses on the dangers of gain-of-function research itself. Paul describes how scientists were actively trying to make viruses more dangerous, including adding a furin cleavage site to enhance infectivity. He notes that researchers had even applied for funding to do this specific manipulation, raising suspicions when the virus that caused the pandemic appeared with this very feature. Paul also introduces the role of ORF8, a unique protein in the virus that interferes with the immune system, suggesting further evidence of intentional manipulation. He points to discoveries made by researchers, like those at Drastic, uncovering unpublished research suggesting gain-of-function work on ORF8 was underway at the Wuhan lab. Paul extends his critique to the broader practice of identifying and collecting viruses from around the world, arguing it could inadvertently create more dangerous situations. He cites concerns from experts like Kevin Esvelt, who believe this practice could provide terrorists with the tools to create bioweapons. Paul explains that the technology to create viruses is becoming increasingly accessible, and the risks outweigh the potential benefits of identifying every virus. He argues that the focus should be on preventing accidental releases and deterring malicious actors, rather than actively seeking out and manipulating potentially dangerous pathogens. He concludes by expressing disappointment in the lack of bipartisan interest in regulating gain-of-function research and preventing future pandemics. Part 5, Holding Deceit Accountable. Rand Paul details a growing frustration with the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, focusing on what he sees as major mistakes made by public health officials and the government. He begins by pointing to a seemingly small detail within a massive spending bill, a provision attempting to stop U.S. funding of risky virus research in places like Wuhan, China. Paul worries that even with this rule, bureaucrats might find ways around it, continuing to support potentially dangerous experiments. He recounts a meeting with Dr. Bob Cadleck, a former Trump administration official, who revealed that the Wuhan research hadn't been properly reviewed for safety because the committee in charge lacked the power to choose what research needed scrutiny or to stop funding. This lack of oversight deeply concerned Paul. Paul argues that current rules about gain-of-function research, making viruses more dangerous or easily spread, are too loose. He explains that scientists like Anthony Fauci have been able to avoid strict rules by arguing that the increased danger was unexpected. Paul compares this to a politician dodging a question, highlighting what he sees as a pattern of avoiding responsibility. He emphasizes the need to regulate experiments that make viruses more easily spread between people, even if they are supposedly for vaccine development. He believes current regulations allow too much leeway, potentially leading to the creation of dangerous viruses. The author stresses the need for a more independent review process for this type of research. He points to recommendations from scientists who suggest a clear separation between approving research and providing funding to avoid conflicts of interest. He uses the example of a scientist receiving a large grant shortly after changing his opinion on the origins of COVID-19 as evidence of this problem. Paul also advocates for including outside experts and even regular citizens in the review process, believing that diverse perspectives are crucial. He even proposed a bill, the Basic Research Act, to add more diverse voices to grant funding committees and make the process more transparent. He illustrates his point with examples of questionable research grants, like spending money on studying puppies with cocaine or hamsters fighting on steroids, arguing that funds could be better used for more important research. Paul criticizes the lack of international control over dangerous research. He suggests the U.S. should lead an effort to create global rules for regulating gain-of-function research, similar to how the world monitors nuclear materials. He also proposes stricter controls on the sale of materials needed to create viruses, like synthetic DNA, arguing that it's too easy for dangerous viruses to be created. He believes that sometimes, even well-intentioned research can be too risky. He points to the idea of identifying all the world's viruses as potentially dangerous, as it could give bad actors the knowledge to create new threats. The author details his efforts to end the COVID-19 emergency declaration, highlighting how the government continued to wield extraordinary powers long after the initial crisis had passed. He explains how the National Emergencies Act allows the president to access a wide range of powers during an emergency, but that Congress has largely allowed these powers to continue unchecked. Paul introduced the Republic Act to limit the duration of emergencies and prevent the president from controlling communications. He argues that these emergency powers pose a threat to freedom and the balance of power. Finally, Paul reveals information from a House Intelligence Committee report that suggests the U.S. government funded research at a Chinese military facility involved in coronavirus research. He highlights the connection between U.S. funding and a scientist who may have been working on a vaccine before the pandemic was officially recognized. He criticizes the intelligence community for withholding information from Congress and expresses concern about the lack of transparency surrounding the origins of COVID-19. Paul concludes that the American people deserve answers and that the failures of the public health bureaucracy during the pandemic must be addressed. Part 6, The Aftermath of Deception. Rand Paul details a frustrating investigation into the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic and a deep disappointment with the response of both American and international authorities. He begins by noting the protests in China following deaths potentially linked to the strict zero-COVID policies, highlighting the risks of authoritarian control and the silencing of dissent. He draws a parallel to past Chinese crackdowns, emphasizing the bravery of those who spoke out, even facing severe consequences like lengthy prison sentences. However, Paul's central argument focuses on what he sees as a betrayal of liberal principles during the pandemic, not just in China, but in Western democracies. He expresses shock that countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States implemented policies like forced vaccinations and strict lockdowns, actions he believes contradict the idea of bodily autonomy. He cites examples like the expulsion of Novak Djokovic from Australia and the forceful detention of protesters, contrasting these actions with what he views as a hypocritical openness to unvaccinated migrants. Paul is particularly critical of the actions taken within the United States. He points to the intense pressure and public shaming of those who question the vaccine, describing a climate of fear and division fueled by media outlets like CNN. He recalls examples of commentators calling for the punishment of the unvaccinated and the ostracization of those who didn't comply with mask mandates. He argues that this created a quasi-religious fervor, where safety became equated with control and punishment of dissenters. He highlights instances of governors enacting restrictions that were later struck down by courts, emphasizing the importance of constitutional protections even during a public health crisis. As a newly empowered member of Congress, Paul sought to investigate the origins of the pandemic, specifically focusing on the funding of research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. He encountered significant resistance from government agencies, facing stonewalling and excessive classification of documents. He details his attempts to obtain information from the State Department, the NIH, and other agencies, highlighting the frustrating process of submitting requests and receiving heavily redacted responses. He points to the discovery of a 2018 grant proposal from the Wuhan lab seeking funding to insert a furin cleavage site into a coronavirus, a feature that made COVID-19 more infectious, as evidence that the virus may have been engineered. Paul emphasizes the role of EcoHealth Alliance, a group that received substantial funding from the U.S. government to study viruses, and questions whether that funding contributed to the pandemic. He reveals internal emails from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, DTRA, showing officials actively working to obstruct his requests for information, fearing negative publicity or misrepresentation of the facts. He describes this as evidence of a deep state, a network of bureaucrats prioritizing self-preservation and cover-up over transparency and accountability. Ultimately, Paul expresses frustration that the truth about the pandemic's origins remains obscured by secrecy and obstruction. He notes that the Department of Energy eventually concluded the pandemic likely originated from a lab leak, but that even this information was initially classified. He argues that the overclassification of information hinders oversight and prevents a full understanding of what happened, and that a more open and honest investigation is crucial to prevent future pandemics. He concludes that the response to COVID-19 revealed a willingness to sacrifice fundamental freedoms in the name of safety, and a disturbing tendency within the government to prioritize control over transparency. Rand Paul details a frustrating and revealing period following initial discoveries about the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, focusing on what he sees as a massive cover-up and the failings of public health institutions. The chapter highlights a shift in understanding, beginning with the Department of Energy and the FBI both concluding the virus likely leaked from a lab in Wuhan, China. Paul argues this admission was delayed, possibly due to political considerations, and only became acceptable when the political climate shifted. He points to earlier warnings about Chinese lab safety, and the fact that researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology were sickened before the pandemic was publicly acknowledged. Paul contends that the mainstream media actively worked to downplay the lab leak theory and discredit anyone who questioned the official narrative, specifically targeting him with accusations of fueling threats against Dr. Anthony Fauci. He provides examples of headlines and news reports that framed his questioning of Fauci as personal attacks rather than legitimate inquiries into the truth. This media bias, according to Paul, created an environment where honest investigation was stifled. Elon Musk's support, sharing a video of Paul's contentious exchanges with Fauci, helped break through some of this resistance. The author emphasizes the repeated denials from Fauci regarding funding gain-of-function research at the Wuhan lab, and how those denials were eventually undermined by evidence. He details his attempts to obtain unclassified documents related to the funding, facing consistent stonewalling from various government agencies, even after a unanimous vote in Congress to declassify the information. Paul expresses deep frustration with the bureaucracy's resistance to transparency, suggesting a deliberate effort to conceal potentially damaging information. Paul describes a pattern of distrust and misinformation, noting that even after evidence emerged supporting the lab leak theory, the Biden administration continued to support gain-of-function research. He recounts a meeting with a Chinese official where he attempted to encourage cooperation in investigating the origins of the virus, but received no indication of willingness to assist. He criticizes the WHO's proposed pandemic accord, arguing it would cede national sovereignty and potentially lead to further restrictions on individual liberties. The author details his ongoing battles with government officials, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken, to obtain crucial documents. He accuses Blinken of deliberately obstructing the investigation, despite promises to cooperate. Paul highlights the hypocrisy of criticizing authoritarian regimes for a lack of transparency while simultaneously concealing information from the American public. He points to the case of Dr. Nicole Safier, who faced vaccine mandates despite a history of autoimmune issues and the known risks of myocarditis, as an example of the inflexible and unscientific nature of the public health response. Rand Paul concludes by revealing newly uncovered evidence emails showing Dr. Fauci and other scientists privately acknowledged the likelihood of a lab leak and the possibility that gain-of-function research was occurring in Wuhan. He argues this proves Fauci deliberately misled the public and calls for accountability. He also criticizes ongoing gain-of-function research, citing a Boston University experiment that created a novel virus with increased transmissibility. Paul expresses concern that the public health bureaucracy has lost the trust of the American people, and that reforms are desperately needed to prevent similar failures in the future. Rand Paul argues that the response to the COVID-19 pandemic revealed serious problems with how public health officials operate. He believes that instead of following the science, many leaders let politics and control guide their decisions. He points to Dr. Martin Kulldorff, a respected Harvard scientist, as an example. Kulldorff wrote an article explaining that COVID-19 was much more dangerous for older people, and suggested rules should reflect that. But his work wasn't published in major medical journals, Paul claims, because it challenged the idea that everyone needed the same strict lockdowns. Paul suggests this censorship was about maintaining control, not protecting people. The author contends that public health officials ignored important facts about who was most at risk. While older people and those with health problems like obesity were more vulnerable, the response wasn't focused on helping those groups specifically. Instead, everyone was told to stay home, and everyday activities were shut down. Paul gives examples like closing gyms and playgrounds, even though people could still gather in large numbers for protests. He highlights the hypocrisy of allowing protests while restricting normal life, pointing to support from figures like Kamala Harris for bail funds for protesters, while strict rules were enforced on individuals. Paul emphasizes the unequal application of rules, noting that California Governor Gavin Newsom sent his children to private school while public schools remained closed. He criticizes teachers' unions for opposing school reopenings, even while their leaders sent their own children to in-person classes. He also points to Stanford professor Jay Bhattacharya, who was silenced online for questioning the lockdowns. The author believes these actions showed a willingness to sacrifice the well-being of children and the economy for political reasons. Rand Paul is deeply critical of Dr. Anthony Fauci, portraying him as someone who prioritized control over truth. He cites an interview where Fauci claimed to sleep fine, despite the possibility that research he funded may have contributed to the pandemic's origin. Paul contrasts this with the concerns expressed by Dr. Shi, a scientist at the Wuhan lab who admitted to losing sleep over the same possibility. The author believes Fauci's denial is a sign of arrogance and a refusal to take responsibility. Paul expresses concern that the mistakes made during the pandemic haven't been addressed. He worries that dangerous research is still being conducted without proper oversight, and that Democrats are blocking efforts to prevent another lab leak. He finds it ironic that the same politicians who want to regulate everything else are unwilling to regulate research that could cause a deadly pandemic. He describes Fauci as embodying a dangerous type of person, someone who believes they always know best and is willing to impose their will on others, even if it harms them. The author argues that the pandemic revealed a dangerous tendency to blindly trust experts without questioning their motives or methods. He believes the media played a role in this by uncritically accepting and spreading the pronouncements of public health officials. Paul concludes that the truth about the pandemic will eventually come out, and that those responsible for the cover-up will be held accountable. He believes history will show that the response to COVID-19 was a failure of honesty, judgment, and ultimately, leadership. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.